Well, as if things weren't bad enough with this COVID-19 pandemic worldwide, this is perhaps the most shocking news of all. In Aceh province in Indonesia, they are really having problems with the public whippings. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Right Angle with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And gentlemen, I was shocked to learn from Yahoo News that 6 people were publicly flogged in Indonesia's Aceh province, which is they call it a conservative province, but we know what that means. They're living under Muslim Sharia law. And these are people who were convicted of breaking Muslim law and were publicly lashed, caned, beaten, whipped, flogged. But with all the social distancing regulations, it's making it really difficult to do a proper public beating these days. Let me read to you from the official who's responsible for doling out the Sharia punishments in the capital city. He says, to comply with current conditions, we're trying to cut unnecessary procedures like the usual opening speech. We just carried out the flogging directly to make it simpler, but we're limiting the number of people involved. Stephen Green, isn't it good to see that the most progressive countries in the world are still making sure that they observe good health practices while they're whipping people who have done things like have sex with people they're not married to and drink?
You know, this just shows, Scott, how soft the world has gotten in recent decades. Do you think that the English during the Black Plague didn't have huge crowds of people gathered for good hang drawing and quartering? Hell no! They packed that place to the rafters. And when they were, emasculating someone and then ripping their bowels out and cutting them into 5 major pieces, you better believe that the crowds turned out for that. None of this social distancing BS. They were rubbing shoulders. They could. It was like a Gallagher show. You could feel the blood spray and hit you, just like a crushed watermelon. So I'm not sure what else to do with this story. It's just.
You're right, Steve. Normally, hundreds of people will show up for these things, but they only had about a dozen onlookers show up this time around. It's really cut into the gate for this business.
Into the gate. That's the thing. There is a human compulsion that kind of draws us to dark things. There are whole websites devoted to this. If you want to see some of the for example, results of terrorist bombing footages, there are websites you can go to for that. I won't name them or any of that thing. Saudi executions and all the rest, and I assume flogging videos are available there too. I wonder, I have to hope, I know this won't come true, but I have to hope, is if the social distance requirements don't maybe take some of the edge off of that need to go and actually witness these things. Maybe we can find out that if I missed Saturday's flogging, that maybe when the flogging becomes more open in a few weeks, I might not have that urge to go see somebody beaten to please my God. I can hope.
Bill Whittle, it's interesting because the whole tenor of the story, the tone of it in this Yahoo News piece was really not so much about what a primitive process they're going through in this day and age, or that there's anything wrong with Sharia law, although they do briefly mention about halfway down into the story that the public whippings are widely criticized by rights groups, but then they immediately add that they can attract hundreds of spectators. In fact, at the end of the story, they quote a guy who says he's glad he's gotten the whipping over with because he's already done 3 months in jail for his drinking sentence. And he's glad to have a chance to go back and celebrate Ramadan with his family. So he's just as devoted as ever. It says, though, and this is probably the most alarming thing of all, most of the offenders whipped on Tuesday were not wearing protective face masks, and images from the scene suggested some participants came into close contact with each other. Bill, what do you think of the horrors of that?
Well, needless to say, I think the entire society is barbaric and primitive. If they had anything like our technological skill, they'd be telewhipping by now. I mean, teleflogging is something that they should have instituted at the beginning of this outbreak. I don't know what's so hard about it. We're able to do this show by remote control. I don't see any reason why the COVID-19 virus should prevent Indonesia from concluding a few fatal beatings. I will say this. Needless to say, I am against flogging people. I'm against that kind of corporal punishment. I think that's a bad idea, but I'm not entirely sure it's a bad idea to fear it. In other words, I grew up in a British school, and I was never flogged in a British school, but I didn't know that I would never be. I was pretty much under the constant assumption that I was about to be, and so was everybody else in the rest of the class. We just had this vision of the headmaster's cane rack, from like the Charlie Chaplin bamboo thing to Lucille from The Walking Dead, and depending on how big your crime was. But I will tell you that it did. I was never so unafraid as I was in those schools. It was only when I got to Dade County that I was genuinely afraid for my life. I'm sorry that the gain is down on the flogging attendance and stuff. It's but it could be worse, in terms of morale for the society. It's true they don't get to have as much flogging as they used to have, and that's going to sting. But at least the floggers aren't taking a knee during the Indonesian, national anthem, and that is what destroys the morale of a country. And so they haven't had to undergo that. I guess they're just going to have to come to they're just going to have to relax their standards, Scott, is what they're going to have to do. They're just going to simply have to loosen up. I know for a certain fact that one of those professional floggers said, I wouldn't flog that guy with a 10-foot pole. Well, now he's going to have to, because the social distancing must be maintained if we're going to contain this terrible virus.
Well, when I first saw this story, I thought it was something from Babylon Bee or something like that it was it meant as a satirical piece, especially because of the sort of dry way it was presented by Yahoo News. Just very forthright. It's like, oh, well, here's something that happens in this culture. Let's make no judgments about it. People get publicly whipped. A large crowd shows up to attend the public whippings for things like gambling and drinking and cavorting. And this guy is saying, well, yeah, I'm so glad that my caning is over with so I can get back and celebrate Ramadan so I can fast with my family. It's no fun to fast in prison. He's literally saying this. It's like, it's much better to fast with family. So everything's just so weird about the whole story and about the journalist's approach to it. And I realize that people can get accustomed to almost anything. Like, this is a normal procedure. And the guy who's in charge of the public punishments, this is his job, and he's like, well, we've had to make some changes around here because of this darn disease. I mean, we're using longer canes and we're trying to maintain social distances. I know we're not perfect, but we're doing the best we can. Like, he's trying in a very sort of responsible, scientifically reasonable manner to conduct this Stone Age corporal punishment procedure that seems to most of the rest of the world like some real throwback. And yet they're on the cutting edge. They're watching President Trump's daily briefings. They're, observing Dr. Fauci's stipulations about how you should conduct yourself in public. So
they're wiping down the polls with alcohol between criminals, yeah.
But that the journalist noted that, saying, well, it was clear that not all the offenders were wearing masks, and there were some situations where people were closer than 2 meters apart. So I guess I really don't have any deep insight into this, other than I think the very fact that this becomes a news story may say something about journalism and the desperation that you get into after you're several weeks into a crisis that essentially has the same storyline day after day after day. They're trying to find some sort of novelty. As my old Journ professor said, news is coups, earthquakes, and three-legged chickens. And so this would fall into the three-legged chicken category. I can only make one suggestion to the governing authorities in the Aceh province of Indonesia, and that is that until we can resume public floggings with full crowds and the normal procedures and everything, we might want to recommend that everybody stay home and self-flog. For Stephen Green and Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.